Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ream Library. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the Reverend Michael C. McFarland S.J. Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at Holy Cross, recently named after Father McFarland, something we're very proud of. Throughout the year, the McFarland Center sponsors and supports programming that encourages dialogue on issues of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can learn more about the center by viewing our website at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, all small case. You can also find recordings of past events online. Tonight's discussion is being recorded for the same purpose, so if you speak, you may find yourself on the web. Fair warning, within a few days. So, on October 7, 2011, we marked, or in some ways didn't mark, as we talked earlier, didn't pay much attention to the fact that it's the 10th anniversary of the war in Afghanistan, which makes it the longest war in American history. Tonight, we're fortunate to have two speakers with distinguished public service records to share their perspectives on the war and what they believe needs to change about that. Congressman Jim McGovern and former Marine Corps Captain and State Department Officer Matthew Hoh. Congressman McGovern, who represents the 3rd District of Massachusetts, which, as we've mentioned, has changed radically in the last week, has been a leading critic of U.S. military policy in Afghanistan, coordinating bipartisan initiatives focused on the human and financial costs of the war, proposals for safely withdrawing U.S. forces from the country, and promoting a political solution for Afghanistan and the region. First elected to Congress in 1996, he is serving his 8th term in the U.S. House of Representatives. He's Senior Minority Whip, the second-ranking Democrat on the powerful House Rules Committee, and a member of the House Agricultural Committee. He's a Worcester native and married to Lisa Murray McGovern, and they have one son, Patrick, and a daughter, Molly. Matthew Hoh was the first U.S. official known to resign in protest over the Afghan war. He did that in 2009. A senior civilian officer stationed in Afghanistan at the time, he cited, quote, doubts and reservations about our current strategy and planned future strategy, end quote, for the war. Matthew has served with the U.S. Marine Corps in Iraq and on U.S. embassy teams in both Afghanistan and Iraq. When not deployed, Matthew worked on Afghanistan and Iraq policy and operation issues at the Pentagon and the State Department from 2002 to 2008. He's a former director of the Afghanistan Study Group and senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. Matthew's writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and his resignation letter has been cited as an essential document by the Council on Foreign Relations. Matthew was awarded the 2010 Ridenour Prize for truth-telling. He lives in Arlington, Virginia. So please join me in welcoming both, and we'll hear first from Congressman McGovern.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for the McFarland Center for kind of a commitment to these kind of dialogues. I'm a great admirer of Father McFarland, and I think this is an appropriate program, the kind of stuff that I think that he would like to see more of, not only on campus but all throughout our country. I want to take this moment also to acknowledge that in the audience today is the new mayor of Worcester, Joe Petty. I want to acknowledge his presence for being here. And I also want to thank Ed Augustus, who is my former chief of staff, former state senator, now here at Holy Cross, for all of his work in helping make this program possible tonight. And I also want to thank the students and faculty who joined us for dinner before this lecture here today. We had a fascinating discussion about everything from why some of the students chose to go into the Navy ROTC, to what is America's foreign policy in general anyway, and the fact that we really can't articulate that. But tonight I'm here with my friend Matt Hoh to talk about Afghanistan. And as Tom mentioned, October 7th marked the 10th anniversary of U.S. military operations in Afghanistan. And I'll be honest with you, on October 7th, I kind of expected these major retrospectives, and analyses to run in newspapers and TV broadcasts all across the country. A group of us, a bipartisan group of us, held a press conference that day. I had 7 Republicans and 5 Democrats. It's usually the other way around. I thought it was a kind of big news that there was this bipartisan agreement that we need to reassess our policy, and nobody showed up, except a few newspapers that I can't remember the names of them. But these major retrospectives and these major analyses did not happen, and it was as if it weren't a major milestone of any kind. And I thought to myself, what is wrong with this picture? Why isn't anyone paying attention to the war, including those who are paid to pay attention? For me, the lack of attention to 10 years of war, of blood and treasure in Afghanistan, is what's been wrong with this war from nearly the very beginning. It was invisible. For the first year and a half, when it was all about smashing al-Qaeda and going after Osama bin Laden, it got some attention. Then President Bush decided that we had to invade Iraq, and then all attention shifted to Iraq. Afghanistan was forgotten, and during a very critical period of time, our military and development policies were neglected, underfunded, and haphazard at best. With the war in Iraq winding down and our troops scheduled to come home, Afghanistan has received more attention, especially following President Obama's decision to escalate our troop presence there. But even so, the war can't compete with the economic crisis here in America, even though it's one of the major drivers of the deficit. You know, on the 10th anniversary, I remember picking up, I think it was the Boston Herald. And on the cover of the Boston Herald was a picture of Elizabeth Warren and Scott Brown, and it was all about the controversy over who took off their clothes to pay for college. And it was just hard for me to believe that after all this, that is the attention that our media was giving it. Yeah, there were a few articles here and there, but it was not as big a deal as I had expected. So, I mentioned this is one of the drivers of the deficit. So the 10-year marker came and went with little fanfare or reflection. And, I see this whole thing very differently. And one of the reasons why I wanted to come here, and one of the reasons why I'm going to urge you at the end of my remarks, is to become involved in an effort to start grilling your members of Congress and your senators, wherever you're from, is because we should care about this. We should care about this. I see over 1,800 servicemen and women killed in Afghanistan, 40 of them from Massachusetts. Over 14,000 wounded. I've been to Walter Reed Hospital. I know Matt has as well. Some of our returning soldiers have brain trauma injuries and injuries that will require a lifetime of care. I remember visiting a young man who had been severely wounded, was missing an arm, had severe brain trauma, couldn't remember conversations that he just had. And he was standing there with his wife, who looked like about 19, who had a young baby in her hands. And I thought, what's the life like for this family? What was this sacrifice about? Husbands and fathers and wives and mothers, sons, daughters, brothers and sisters. Holes have been created in families and communities that can never be filled. Losses that will be felt for a generation or more. I've lost count of how many funerals that I've been to here in Massachusetts and around the country of people who I've known, or families I've known who have had loved ones who have died in this war, in the war in Iraq. Each month, the tally of dead and wounded gets higher. 2010 was the deadliest year for American troops in the history of the Afghanistan war. And 2011 is on pace to surpass it. Each month, I find out that May was the deadliest month so far for the war. Then it was June, then it was July, then August, September. It just goes on and on and on. We've become numb to the numbers. We don't even hear them anymore. But these losses resonate around family kitchen tables in the homes of the deployed every day and every night of the year. This Friday, we will celebrate Veterans Day with parades and patriotic fanfare. But we all know that the human cost of the war is found not only on the battlefields of Afghanistan, it's also found in our veterans' hospitals and counseling clinics all around the country. We continue to struggle with soaring rates of traumatic brain injuries, one of the signature wounds of this war, post-traumatic stress, and suicide among our soldiers and our veterans. So many leave the service to try and carry on military careers, wounded in both body and soul. These impacts affect not just our national budget for medical treatment and care, but they are devastating for families, friends, colleagues, and military buddies. In June, researchers at Brown University released a report detailing the total costs of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, including benefits and the care of our veterans and the interest paid on servicing the debt. They estimate that the true costs of the war will be between $3.7 trillion and $4.4 trillion over the coming decades. Trillion. According to the Congressional Research Service, the estimated funding for military operations, the war funding, for Iraq and Afghanistan since 9/11 through September of this year has been $1.283 trillion. $443 billion of that has been spent in Afghanistan. For fiscal year 2012, which began on October 1st, we aim to spend another $113.7 billion in Afghanistan. By this time next year, our total spending on war in Afghanistan will be $557.1 billion, or over $500 billion. $10 billion each month, $2.3 billion each week, $326 million each day, $13.6 million each hour. During the course of tonight's forum, we will have spent another $20 to $26 million on military operations in Afghanistan. And when I say spend, as I said before, I really mean borrow. Because from day one of the Afghanistan war, and the Iraq war for that matter, we have not paid for the military operations in these wars. We have borrowed nearly every single penny of that money. We have put it on the national credit card. We have let it rack up over a quarter of our cumulative deficit and helped explode our debt year after year for a decade. There has been only one other time in the history of the United States that a war was financed entirely through borrowing without raising taxes, and that was when the 13 colonies, including the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, borrowed from France during the Revolutionary War. I know lots of people in the United States believe in the Tea Party, but that's just stupid economics. Even if we were to leave Afghanistan and Iraq tomorrow, and I'm so glad to see our troops coming home from Iraq by Christmas, our war debt will continue for decades. Currently, over 2.35 million troops have been deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq. Future bills will include such things as caring for these veterans and providing them the benefits they have earned through their service. It will require replacing military equipment, rebuilding our armed forces, and paying for interest on the trillions we have borrowed for these wars. These costs are unbelievably significant. And I often ask myself, for what? For 10 years of support for a corrupt government in Afghanistan? 10 years of sacrificing our brave uniformed men and women? 10 years of borrowing money we never had? This war is no longer about going after al-Qaeda, which I voted to do. Osama bin Laden is dead. Instead, we're now bogged down in a seemingly endless occupation in support of an incompetent, corrupt Karzai government. This is not what I voted for. It's hard to explain. I should say, by the way, that we got Osama bin Laden not with 100,000 troops in Afghanistan because he wasn't there. We got him with a small, elite, well-trained group of Navy SEALs in Pakistan. And, it's hard to explain how we could borrow and spend so freely, so casually over the past decade, while our men and women bled in the plains and valleys and mountains of Afghanistan. But now we have to face the consequences of that lack of accountability, that lack of responsible governance. When the super committee, which I think is a very bad idea, but when the super committee makes its decisions on how to handle the deficit and debt, I say ending the wars as rapidly as possible must be the first item on the table. I also say that from this point forward, the wars must be paid for. No more emergency funding, no more so-called overseas contingency operation accounts that get a free pass for responsible budgeting. I believe President Obama has to bring this to the negotiations, and the House and Senate members who sit on the super committee have to step up to the plate and end these wars now. They have undermined our economy, and I think they have undermined our national security. Now, if you don't support ending this war right now, then the very least you can do is pay for it. And to tell the American people exactly how you're going to pay for it. There has been no shared sacrifice in this war. Only the men and women, the incredible men and women serving in the war and their families have been required to sacrifice, serving for over a decade in harm's way on multiple deployments. They deserve our respect and they deserve our gratitude. They deserve a job when they get home. And they deserved a lot better than what they got. A mission that must have changed at least 10 times over 10 years. We were saying over dinner that if you had 20 members of Congress sitting around the table, and you gave them a piece of paper and a pencil, and you said, write down what our mission in Afghanistan is, and then collected them all, you'd have 20 different responses. If you asked them to then write down what is success in Afghanistan, you'd probably get 20 different answers. No one knows. There's no clarity to our policy. You know, in the years after the Vietnam War, one of the kind of rallying cries was never again will we go to war without a clearly defined mission. We do not have a clearly defined mission in Afghanistan by any measure. There is no clearly defined mission. Even when you go to Afghanistan and you talk to, whether it's our ambassador or someone from our CIA or somebody from the, who heads our military operations, you get different answers. There is no clarity. And I've been to Afghanistan twice. First time was in 2009, and the second time was just this past June. And I have to say that I've most appreciated the time I got to spend with the troops from Massachusetts, because I got to tell you about Massachusetts people. They tell it like it is. No sugarcoating. In April, I was in Afghanistan with two other members of Congress, one from California, a guy named Duncan Hunter Jr., Republican, and another one from Florida, a guy named Alan West, another Republican. And we sat down with the soldiers from those states. They were all very deferential and saying everything was okay, don't worry about them. But we sat down with the troops from Massachusetts, and I asked, what did I need to know? What should I know about serving in Afghanistan? Well, let me tell you, they didn't hesitate to tell me. And one guy said to me, you know, I've seen a buddy blown up and killed, and I'm having trouble dealing with it. And I come back here, and I put on the radio, and I hear President Karzai, the leader of Afghanistan, denigrate U.S. troops and say we're responsible for human rights violations and we're the problem. He said, you know how that makes me feel? He said, what the hell are we doing here? Tell me, what the hell are we doing here? You know, we're supporting a guy who is who heads up one of the most corrupt governments in the world. It takes a lot of work to be one of the most corrupt governments in the world. But that's in Afghanistan. You know, that's who we're dying for. You know, that's who we're going in debt for. You know, is that what our policy is? Why are we doing this? You know, why are we doing this? And while I found most of our military and State Department officials in Afghanistan to be of the highest quality, I mean, these are men and women who really serve, you know, for all the right reasons, who I think want to make a difference, who believe in this country and who want to be helpful to our country. And I found them to all be really men and women of high caliber. But I became deeply worried, I have to tell you, when I was talking with a couple of them about where we're going from here and what happens next and what is the future we envision for our remaining time in Afghanistan. And one key official described the efforts in Afghanistan, and I wrote it down, like building a sandcastle at low tide. And I asked him, well, you know, so what do we do? And his response was, well, we need to expand this war into Pakistan. Because the Taliban, well, we're now fighting the Taliban, not Al-Qaeda, but the Taliban, he says, you know, fight our soldiers and then seek refuge and sanctuary in Pakistan. And so we need to go into Pakistan after them. And I said, well, but wouldn't the Pakistani government be mad if we went in there? He said, well, some would be mad. He said, I think some would be happy. But wouldn't that be a declaration of war? Possibly. And then what happens? You know, I mean, spreading this war to other countries, you know, with all due respect, I have to tell you, with every ounce of sense I have, tells me it is the wrong thing to do. And when I asked another person who was working on regional negotiations to supposedly secure a permanent solution to the conflict, because everybody tells me that ultimately there's only a political solution to be had here. And I always ask, at what point does the military contribution to the political solution come to an end so we can bring our troops home? But when I asked about the negotiations, nobody I talked to was working on a political solution to the conflict in Afghanistan, let alone, regionally based, which ultimately I think is the answer in Afghanistan. So I'm really worried when I pick up the newspapers and I read on the front pages that we're looking to expand our forces in the region and exploring the possibilities of keeping at least some 30,000 troops in Afghanistan through 2025 as part of a status of forces agreement or a SOFA agreement. I mean, we're going to be there now through 2025 with 30,000 troops maybe? What are we doing? I'm not going to go on much longer because I want you to hear from Matt Hoh, who I think, is someone who, as you know, resigned his post with the U.S. government for reasons of principle. How often do you hear that? His experience and knowledge of the intricacies of U.S. military and development policy has really helped bring greater understanding and credibility to those of us who have been critical of the war. So let me just end with the following thoughts. I think deep down, President Obama wants to end this war. I think he understands. I've talked to him on this. I think he's trying to find a way to end this war. And one of the problems in Washington right now, and don't ask me to explain this because I'm not a psychologist, but the fact of the matter is there's this mentality that we can't look weak, we can't look like we're retreating, we can't look like we're losing, we can't afford not to save face. I mean, all these things that, which basically are excuses to kind of keep going, or keep a contingency still there. Those aren't good enough reasons, in my opinion, to keep American forces there. I'm not a big, I believe war should be the absolute last resort. And I believe that the huge presence of U.S. forces over there is not enhancing our national security. And if I were president, quite frankly, I'd rethink some of our military bases over there. I think they incite more than they provide protection. If we want some sort of strategic agreement with other countries, let's work that out. But, military bases all over the Middle East, I don't think have been very good for our image. They've been costly. And if it were up to me, I'd close a lot of them. Because I don't think it's in our national security interests. But it is imperative in the upcoming presidential campaign that there is a debate, that there's a discussion on this war. If you have opportunities to see President Obama, raise this issue. I think we could be the wind at his back to help him do the right thing. And I want there to be a gigantic gust at his back because I feel so strongly we need to end this war. If you're a Republican, talk to the Republican candidates. Some of them actually agree with you. Ron Paul, actually, he and I work together on some of these things. But we need to get the other candidates to be talking about what is your policy for Afghanistan. What is your foreign policy? What is your policy for Afghanistan? How do you see this war going? Do you see it ending, or are you going to continue it? We need to know what's going on. And, I just want to say, don't count on politicians to end the war on their own. If you want to change things in this country, you have to be involved. You have to be part of this solution. There's multiple states that are represented in this room. Call your member of Congress, call your senator, write them, email them, text them, go onto their Facebook, raise this issue, ask them to discuss it. This is important, and and try to get an answer. Try to build relationships with their staffs. Try to get into a dialogue with them. Mount demonstrations. If 25 people show up in front of my office with signs, I take notice. I don't need 2,500. 25 would be a big deal. 25 showing up in front of Scott Brown's office or John Kerry's office or any member of the delegation, or any member of Congress throughout the country. It's a big deal. Do it. Get them. You need to help pressure members of Congress to end this war. You need to demand that we end this war. I have a webpage, jimmcgovern.com, and there's a petition to the super committee to make ending the war a priority. Look it up and sign up. I'm sending all these names to the super committee. Let them know what's happening. It's really up to us, and it's really up to you. And I will just conclude with this. I am really heartened that so many people showed up tonight because, and I think our soldiers, our men and women who are serving overseas, and those who are serving in the State Department overseas, would be heartened to know that this room is packed with people that actually care about what's happening to them. This is your country. And if you don't like the way things are going, you need to take a stand. You need to push back. And if you don't, then don't expect this policy to change. If you don't, politicians will just keep this going. And so, having said that, I will conclude my remarks and turn it over to my friend Matt Hoh.
If folks in the back want to come forward, I don't know if there's any more seats or spaces, but if you want to, yeah, get hit in the head with the door. Well, hey, thank you for having me here this evening. I want to thank Holy Cross, Tom, Ed, everyone who's involved in having me come up here. Also want to thank Mr. McGovern, because the work I do, I do research on the war, and a lot of my work is on the Hill, looking at public opinion data. And going back and looking at it 2 years ago, the public opinion polls on the war weren't that different. In terms of people who were in favor of the war, it's never gone above 50%. Even going back 4 or 5 years, public opinion on the war in Afghanistan has not really ever topped 50%. But what you have, just as Congressman was saying as he was wrapping up, was a Congress that's not going to do anything. Politicians aren't going to do anything unless it's somehow affecting them. And so what I've seen over the last 2 years is Mr. McGovern, along with Walter Jones, Republican from North Carolina, take the lead on this issue. And it's gone from kind of a backseat, it's going nowhere. The president 2 years ago felt like he had no support behind him, couldn't do anything differently, then escalate the war, to the point now where I believe you're not the opposition, you're now the support the president needs to end the war in Afghanistan, bring our troops home, and to a larger point, have a larger dialogue in this country about where our foreign policy is going, what our national priorities are, and what we want the future of this country to look like. So I just want to thank Mr. McGovern for having the courage over the last 2 years to lead on this issue, to let the White House know where the American public stands on this issue. And it means a lot to me, and I want to thank you for all your efforts. So I also want to say tomorrow's a Marine Corps birthday. I was a Marine. Any of the Marines in the room here tonight, happy early birthday. Before I forget. I forgot my little lapel pin. So, so if you look at where we were with the war in Afghanistan 2 years ago and the policy that we enacted at that point, the idea was that we were going to surge forces into Afghanistan, that we were going to increase efforts at connecting the Afghan population to their government, and that through these efforts, 2 things were going to occur. One, our military was going to weaken the insurgency, that we were going to basically beat them into submission, push them to the negotiating table, as well as then, by the efforts on the civilian side, by strengthening the Afghan government, we were going to connect the people to the government, thereby giving the Afghan people less reason to support the insurgency and more reason to support the government. 2 years later, looking at this, by all measures, we failed. the Afghan war is no closer to ending, in the sense for the Afghans, than it was 2 years ago. Okay, we had a policy that even though we are on a timeline, we are committed to withdrawing and pulling troops out, and I believe the President will continue to do that. Maybe not as fast as I would like, or Mr. McGovern, or many others here in the room, and that's why we need to continue to give him our support on this issue and provide alternatives and provide, again, support to the President for these things, for the Afghans themselves, for the war, and then for that region, which we have seen only destabilize every year at a near exponential rate. The war is not ending anytime soon. What we did was we intensified the war. We escalated the war. We put more troops in. We put more money in. Okay? If you go back, if you Google the Boston Globe, you'll find in September of '09, the Boston Globe had a report leaked from our intelligence agencies that talks about how 8 or 9 out of 10 insurgents fight the U.S. presence because they're fighting foreign occupation. Okay? So we knew that the main motivator for insurgent recruits was the presence of foreign troops. So what we do? We put more foreign troops in. If you look at the Afghan government, incredibly corrupt, predatory, illegitimate. Another reason that people join the insurgency, another reason that people turn to the insurgency. What did we do? We gave it more money. We increased its size. We brought it to places that hadn't been in Afghanistan before. Okay, so we shouldn't be surprised that the insurgency is actually larger now than it was a couple of years ago. We supported 2 elections that were incredibly fraudulent and stolen. So let alone the people who support the insurgency because they feel like they're marginalized and excluded from the political process in Afghanistan to begin with. So forget about primarily the Southern Pashtuns who are the bulk of support for the Taliban insurgency. All those folks in Karzai's camp already who participated in the political process, but then were disenfranchised and excluded from it because 2 elections were stolen in a row. You now have those people disenfranchised and marginalized as well. And that's why you've seen a decrease in, or fracturing in the base of support for Karzai within his own camp. So we shouldn't be standing here wondering what happened. You know, we shouldn't have any doubts as to why we're in this circumstance because we knew what this, we knew the factors that were driving insurgency. We knew what the root causes of the conflict were. Okay, and it's a conflict that operates on multiple layers. It's multi-sided. There's different aspects of it. Some of it's ethnic, some of it's regional. Some of it's proxy war for Pakistan and India. Some of it's just pure Hatfields versus McCoys. Okay, and we're giving more money and supporting the Hatfields with troops, which only pushes the McCoys further towards the insurgency. Excuse me. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're in this situation. Okay, and I don't think there's any argument, or there shouldn't be any argument, that it has failed. If you look at the metrics, and there's some disagreement now between the Department of Defense and other international agencies over the metrics behind the war. Our Department of Defense say that they see a downward trend to the war. Nearly everyone else says it's increasing. It just kind of reminds you of the whole, those lies, damn lies, and statistics mantra. All right, but what you see is you see things that you can't refute. Improvised explosive devices, roadside bombs, are being put into the ground more and more frequently. Putting an IED into the ground is not a simple endeavor. It doesn't involve just 1 or 2 people. These are complex organizations and networks that require financing, that require logistic support, that require intelligence support, that require operational chains. So when you see reports from the Department of Defense saying that IEDs have been placed into the ground 70% more this year than last year, which comes out to about 56 times a day, we find or get hit by an IED in Afghanistan. You have an insurgent network that is very capable and that has not been degraded whatsoever. So what you also get into is you get in this, and everyone has seen the assassination campaign, right? So what we do is we set up in Afghanistan, we set up a corrupt patriot network okay, and put the mantle or the covering of democracy over it. But all it really is a corrupt patriots network. What are the Taliban? What does the insurgency counter that with? Assassinations. And so we see assassinations occurring at all levels of the government, local, provincial, national. Some are well known, some are well publicized, whether it's the former president of Afghanistan or Hamid Karzai's brother. Some of it's just simply local leaders. Okay? But what they're doing is we've set up this, again, corrupt patriots network to govern the country, and they're just knocking out pieces of it. And that's why you see this vacuum within the country of governance. That's why there is no ability for the government to do anything anyway, because it's based upon an illegitimate, predatory system that is not supported by the population, and it's easily attacked by the insurgency. And also what you see is these on a regular basis, like every 10 days on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or in the New York Times or the Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, there's a cover story on a major attack launched by a Taliban. And it's usually bigger than the last one, or more spectacular, or more daring than the last one. And it grabs the headlines. So on a strategic level, in terms of strategic communications, they've done a fantastic job of owning that. And we're the land of Hollywood. And we can't get our message out on this war. The insurgency does it every 10 days, tells the world that we're winning. So we're in this position now where I think we're in the worst place possible for negotiations in Afghanistan that we've been in since 2001. I think in 2009 we had a window of opportunity. That's when I served there. I was there as a political officer. I worked for the State Department. I was attached to what was called a Provincial Reconstruction Team in southern Afghanistan. So in 2009, what I saw was our president came in, escalated the war in Afghanistan, but then went through this big review, okay, about whether or not we're going to escalate this war. As you know, some people, if you read Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, you'll see whether or not the president actually received any real alternatives other than small, medium, or large escalation. I tend to think he didn't. But what we saw on the other side, though, was an insurgency reaching out for us. Okay? If you look at the Taliban's websites that they maintain, there's a lot of propaganda on there, there's a lot of nonsense on there, but if you looked at them, you would see throughout there a constant message. This is why we're fighting, to rid the nation of occupation, and we're willing to talk. Our answer to that continued to be, we have preconditions for talk. One, renounce al-Qaeda, which they basically did in a statement in 2009. Lay down your weapons and accept the Constitution, which basically means surrender. We heard through the Pakistani military and the Pakistani intelligence services. We saw through Middle Eastern media outlets that they were interested in speaking to us. And on the ground, you'd see that, directly and indirectly. Indirectly, you'd have it happen, or not really indirectly, but more directly, I guess. I would go with my governor to places, and you meet with locals in a village, be 30 or 40 or 50 men, and the insurgency would be present, and they would be there, and they would talk to you. Well, they wouldn't identify themselves, but you would know who they were. And they would say, look, we've been fighting this country for over 30 years. We're tired, but we don't want to surrender, or we're not going to surrender. And then you look at who you were standing there with, and you're standing there with guys that they've been fighting for 30 years. Men who came from other ethnicities, men who came from other regions, men who came from other backgrounds. You know, because among other things, Afghanistan is like a red state versus blue state thing going on there. Okay, between like the urban, the modern, the secular, the progressive, and the traditional, the rural, the religious, etc. So I had one instance where when I was in Jalalabad, which is in the east, we were actually directly contacted by the insurgency and said, look, we want to come in by Hezbi Islami Gulbadim, which is about the third largest insurgent group in the country. And they said to us, we want to come in, we want to talk, we want to get into negotiations. I turned around with that information to the embassy. The embassy responded to me saying, stay out of it. We're not involved with reconciliation. This is an Afghan affair. So I turned to give that information to the governor, who has no interest in reconciliation because our presence there is making him rich. And this goes nowhere. Okay? And what you're up against at that point in 2009 was an American narrative that we were going to win, that militarily we were going to defeat the insurgency. Okay, for a variety of reasons, some of which Congressman McGovern spoke about in terms of saving face and other things. So I think at that point, we pushed away the opportunity to talk because we were going to win militarily. All right, we're going to stand there, arms crossed, and say we're going to defeat them. Our leaders made statements that were not true. You know, the blood of 9/11 was on Mullah Omar's hands. Okay, we have to clear Kandahar because that's where the 9/11 attacks came from. You follow that line of thought, we need to clear, you know, Germany, Spain, Dubai, Malaysia, Florida, California, you know, et cetera. I mean, so what we did was we spurned these offers, and we said, no, we're going to beat you. And what they said was, okay, we'll fight you. And so like two kids on the playground, the last couple of years, we've duked it out. And now we're in this stalemate. But now we're leaving. And they've withstood our onslaught. And we've spurned them. We rejected their previous offers. So why, at this point, would they be interested in negotiating? Would any of you negotiate at this point if you were them? So we've really put ourselves into quite a bind. Okay? And it's fine if the United States leaves Afghanistan, because it's not going to affect us. Al-Qaeda's not there. It's a country with a GDP of about $15 billion. It's important for a number of reasons we'll get into in a minute, but we're going to be okay. But Afghanistan and the region won't be okay if we allow that country to implode. There's several reasons for this. I mean, chief foremost, if it goes back to the way it was in the 90s, does anyone here want to see 2, 3, 4 million refugees going into Iran or Pakistan? Do you think that's good for regional stability or overall world events? So we have real reasons. But I think what's so important is that this was our making. You know, I agree with going in there in 2001, going in there after Al-Qaeda, removing the Taliban from power, et cetera. But that was 10 years ago. And over the last several years, we have willingly chosen to escalate this war. So we don't have an option just to abandon it, because that would be a huge moral failing on our part. But to say that we can't ever leave is equally as wrong. Right? So some of the ideas that you have that you can look at, and I want to wrap this up because I want to get into conversation with you all in discussion, is that there are certain things we can be doing and should be doing. First and foremost is abandoning this idea, this notion that we have to maintain a long-term presence or have permanent bases in Afghanistan. That strikes at the very reason why so many Afghans now support the insurgency. You have to remove that. And for what purpose? And one of the things that we were talking about earlier tonight at dinner, and something that, you know, hopefully we'll get to later, and I have down here, is that we have to get into a larger conversation of what American grand strategy is. What does America stand for in this world, and what are we going to do? What are our goals and what are our priorities, and how are we going to achieve them? We haven't had a conversation like that since probably 1947 or 1948. We certainly didn't have it after the Soviet Union fell. We certainly really didn't have it after 9/11, except for hysteria and throwing money at the problem. So I think it's time that we have to have a conversation in this country that addresses these things. Why would we need permanent bases in Afghanistan? Well, if you listen to people in Washington, D.C., they'll tell you it's because you need to contain China, contain Iran. That's insane. The Chinese buy one 30-year-old aircraft carrier from the Soviet Union that can barely float, and we think they want to recreate the Battle of Midway. I mean, like, our notions on the world and everything are mired in what has occurred over the last several decades. And going back to what Congressman McGovern was talking about earlier, we need brighter and better thinking on these things. We need people who are in touch with the world. And I realize I'm starting to go way off topic here and off of my page, but why, when we talk about Iran, are there only two options? Why? The only thing we can do is economic sanctions or bomb them. You know, if you look at what occurred this past year throughout the Arab world, Why did those regimes fall? They fell because, for a number of reasons, but it was enabled by communications, by the open transfer of populations, by people being able to visit, people being able to move, people being exposed to new ideas. So why are those the only options we have when it comes to Iran, economic sanctions or bombing them? Castro's been around for, how many presidencies has he lasted? And some of the harshest economic sanctions possible. And why would you be in favor of military action after this last decade? The only thing I can guarantee you about military action against Iran, it will not end well. It will end in a manner that we have not conceived or have not thought about. That's the only thing I can guarantee you about military action against Iran. But sorry to as I move off, but there's a lot of things we could do. We were thinking about Afghanistan in ways that we could bring about a negotiated solution. Another issue, we haven't spoken at all about Pakistan, and we'll probably get into that later on. We have to acknowledge that Pakistan does not share our interests, that Pakistan is not our partner, and that we're not going to change them either. No matter how much military assistance or economic assistance we give them, we're not going to change Pakistan. We have to be much more synergy in our policies. Right now, our commanders in Afghanistan are not speaking to the insurgency. They're not talking to the insurgency. And we know the insurgency is an incredibly localized event. It's an incredibly localized organization. And our military commanders are not speaking to them. They're not authorized to do so. I was told the other day by a very senior administration official, we could never do that because you can't have these commanders doing their own thing. So what that means is that up very high, you have a few State Department, CIA, and Department of Defense people trying to negotiate with the insurgency, and everything below is focused on either killing or spending money. Nothing to do with negotiations. So we don't have any synergy in our policies. Our tactics do not reflect the strategy, and I would tend to agree that there probably isn't much of a strategy to even define, let alone what alone are our goals here. So, I'm always still continuing to be an advocate for troop withdrawal. So many of the people we're fighting in Afghanistan are fighting us just because we're there. We pull our troops out of certain areas, the violence and the fighting goes away. And you can see this. And if we instructed our commanders to talk to insurgency, we would know. Why aren't our commanders saying to insurgency, hey, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, you weren't fighting us. Why are you fighting us now? And I guarantee you it'll be because you're here in our area or you brought in the Afghan government, which we don't want. So there's a number of things. There's talk between things, the drone strikes, the night raids, all kinds of things that we know are pushing people to insurgency and destabilizing not just Afghanistan, but the region. So I realize I've gone on longer than I should have, and I definitely went down a separate road there for a little bit. But I look forward to talking to you all about this. I want to echo what Mr. McGovern said about you have to take part in this. So many times I go into members of Congress offices, both in the Senate and the House side, and every time I go in, I ask, when was the last time you guys got a phone call about Afghanistan? And they usually don't know. Every week in these offices, they'll sit down and they'll have a top 10 things that people call in about, or top 5, or however many. And Afghanistan, most of the time, doesn't make that top 5 or top 10 list. So if these members of Congress are not hearing about it, they're not going to move on it. So I want to encourage you all to take part in this. The war is not over by far. If you go to the website icasualties.org, you can see that with the names and details of those who are killed there on a daily basis. But I want to thank you all for coming out. I look forward to the conversation, and thanks again for having me up here.
Thanks. An awful lot to talk about there. Some questions, comments to start? Who'd like to? Can you stand up?
Oh, sure. We can have a wonderful conversation and make some wonderful decisions about what our foreign policy should be and what our policy should be in the Middle East. But if the real underlying reasons are, and they're kind of secret, and it's that a lot of
Well, I think you raised raised some important points, but let me just take issue with this. We can argue about the reasons why we do certain things, and, clearly, when conflicts begin, and we're producing weapons or producing whatever, I mean, there are some people that make profits, but but if you want to stop the war, you can still stop it if enough people demand that it end. I mean, I really believe that. It amazes me that because there's lots of, powerful special interests and lobbyists and, and rapid response teams for some of these corporate interests that, we can't eliminate a, tax loophole that benefits people who own corporate jets, because there's pushback. I mean, there's actually there are people who believe we should maintain that, and they are vocal and they are active. I mean, I just wish that we had more people pushing, on this issue of war and beginning and having the discussion. It's not just, ending the war. We were talking about it at dinner. I mean, we need a deeper discussion, but we're not even talking about these things. You pick up the newspaper, we're not reading about these things. I don't want to know any more about Michael Jackson's doctor, okay? I know more than I ever want to know. Yeah, maybe it ranks as a story, but this is nuts. I mean, and yet real problems like this aren't being discussed. In Congress last week, we spent a whole day debating a bill reaffirming that in God we trust is our motto. And I really, I had a little minor meltdown on the House floor because I didn't know it needed to be reaffirmed. I didn't know anybody, it's on the dollar bill, it's behind, where the speaker sits. Why are we talking about that when there are so many other things to talk about? We're becoming a society where trivial issues get debated passionately and important ones not at all. This is important. We have men and women who are in harm's way. This is the way, this policy impacts the way we're viewed around the world. So take a page out of the National Rifle Association. I mean, they basically own Congress right now because of their lobbying techniques, but they push back. And I mean, we have to push back. Politicians will not change the status quo unless they feel some pressure, and it's that simple. I believe this war can be ended. I believe the war in Iraq is coming to an end because the pressure will continue to build. I think the president wants to end this war. I think he's wondering whether there's any wind at his back. I think his political advisors are saying to him, wait a minute, you don't want to look weak. You just got Osama bin Laden. Do you want to look weak on this? I mean, I think people need to push, and I think I really believe we can end this war. I really believe that. And I also believe it could create an opportunity to have the larger discussion about what is our role in the world, what is our foreign policy, what are we all about?
Yeah, I'd like to add that there are people who just like the idea of the nation being at war. It's good for, certain industries, of course, but there are people who like the idea of being at war. Whether they be politicians or media or whoever. Karl Rove was excited when the idea of President Bush being a wartime president. There are people who just like that idea. One thing we have to look at is how is our policy making, decision making set up? A friend of mine who loves to point out that the only organization in the U.S. government that can do any planning is the Department of Defense. No one else can plan. No one else can put together the resources necessary to put together a plan of action. State Department really can't do it. CIA can't do it. USAID certainly can't. So when your only tool you're offered is the proverbial hammer, every problem looks like the nail, right? I mean, so that's an issue we have is and again, I will go back to Bob Woodward's book. Look at the options that were given the president. You can escalate the war small, medium, or large. Even Joe Biden's plan that was supposedly the counter to McChrystal's plan that was going to de-escalate the war wasn't going to de-escalate the war. He was in favor of sending 20,000 troops to Afghanistan. What the president did was just kind of make a split between Biden's plan and McChrystal's middle plan. And you saw that if you read the book, that the president came up with his own plan because he wasn't giving any options. So I think that's something we have a conversation about is how is our decision-making made? You know, how is our policy, how's that sausage made? You know, and what tools do we have out there? What's available out there? You know, I put those things out there as well.
Sir?
The president's had some great foreign policy achievements and has actually accomplished some things that people in the past, past administrations have been unable to do. You know, they got Osama bin Laden. They took out Gaddafi. They were able to support the Arab Spring without being directly involved in putting troops on the ground. So how do we frame this concept of getting out of Afghanistan in a way that is that people can accept it as being reasonable and without being concerned that it's going to somehow damage their pride or damage our country's standing in the world? Do you have any concrete suggestions as to how we do this?
Well, I think, I think we should get out of Afghanistan because I think it's in our national security interest to get out of Afghanistan, period. And I think for all the reasons that Matt just outlined in his talk, explaining why what we're doing in some respects is very counterproductive and not achieving any kind of result that anybody claims that they want, which is some sort of a political solution. I think if you look at the polls, the American people overwhelmingly now want us to end this war. Overwhelmingly. I mean, it's not like 20% want to end the war and 80% want to continue it. It's overwhelming public opinion saying enough. And I think people, really would appreciate a discussion in this country about what national security really means. And I got to be honest with you, I think it means more than just what we do overseas. It means more than our military bases. It means more than the wars we're involved with. It means security for American people, and that means things like jobs and health care and, just able to earn a decent living. And I was at an audience earlier today. I said, what are your constituents most fearful of? It's not Osama bin Laden's brother coming through their front door. It's about whether they're going to have a job tomorrow, whether they can pay their mortgage. And I think, I think the American people are ahead of the politicians. They were ahead of us on Iraq. They're ahead of the politicians on Afghanistan. This is a discussion that is long overdue, and I don't think the president will pay any. I don't care what that people want to say about it. This is not just a liberal Democrat speaking. I remember in the last campaign I did a debate with the Tea Party people. I put my bulletproof vest on and walked in and I got booed and hissed on everything except on when I talked about the need to bring this war to an end or to pay for it. That was the one time everybody nodded approvingly. I think this is not about party line and philosophy. I think people in this country genuinely want us to bring this to an end, and I don't. I think a little straight talk would be very much appreciated at this point.
I think that's exactly it. I think it's clear and articulate leadership from the president. I think that's exactly what is needed, and that's what's called for. The problem that you're up against and the president's up against with Afghanistan is that, for 10 years, that's who attacked us in 9/11. We've had this convoluted, twisted myth of a story about 9/11 in terms of what the attacks were, how the attacks were carried out, who the attackers were, et cetera. It's in, at times the narrative was important for us, but now it's put us in this box where if we leave Afghanistan, the opposition to the argument says we'll have another 9/11 on our hands. When if you look at the reality of the attacks, the organization that attacked us, everything else, it's got nothing to do with the geographical base they were at that point. So I think it's just clear and outspoken leadership on behalf of the president on this issue, knowing he's going to take hits and knowing that he'll be demonized on it if there is a terror attack. But it's something he has to do. I think about on December 1st, 2009, he authorized 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan. And then about 25 days later or whatever on Christmas, that Nigerian kid, Abdul Muttalib, tried to light his underwear on fire on the airliner over Detroit. And his political opposition went berserk. I mean, he's kind of up against it regardless, so I think it's just leadership on his part at this point.
Any points that people would like to challenge about what's been brought up?
Well, I just want to add something about how we frame
Okay.
the argument to get out of the war. I mean, I read fairly recently how Osama bin Laden tallied up the effects of 9/11. Now, we talk about the 3,000 people we lost and everything. He didn't care about that at all. He cared about the economic cost to the United States of the event itself, how it impacted the economy, the billions it cost the airlines, he told that, and then, of course, the cost, we totally took the bait, got involved in endless war. That was what he was really hoping for. So every day we continue this war, and he called it the drip, 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 just dripping away our lifeblood in these endless wars. So that is the victory that Al-Qaeda was really hoping for, and we're doing it to ourselves.
Yeah, there's a quote he made in 2004, said along lines that all you have to do is send 2 mujahideen to either side of the globe, raise a flag with jihad written on it, and the American generals will race there and bankrupt America. And he said that in 2004.
It's just a game of whack-a-mole,
Yeah.
and it never ends. And that's the real victory for them, is that he wanted to lead us dry economic, and that has been the effect.
In the back?
Yeah, I am actually from Afghanistan, and I'm from Pakistan province, which is on the Pashtun area. So I agree with what both of you said, and I will try to explain why this is complicated, that the U.S. how it went there and how things went wrong in Afghanistan. I was grown up in Pakistan. I have been to the northern area of Waziristan, and I've also been to the southern Waziristan, and to Peshawar as well. They're all dominated by the Pashtun people, and they were the backbone that the area, the Shamali Waziristan called Miran was the backbone in defeating the British people from Pakistan. When Mr. Durham came to Afghanistan and he decided that he wanted to go to take Afghanistan so he can go through to Pakistan and then make the way to India. These people were the ones who fought for the freedom of Pakistan. The Pakistan government, in addition to that, made a resolution with these people. They said, we will not send you any troops to this area. You will have local militias running this area. You will also have free electricity in this area. You will have no taxes on any food, anything that we send from Islamabad, Lahore, Karachi to this area. So when this 9/11 happened in the United States in horrific events, I would say that all of the Taliban are Pashtuns, but not all the Pashtuns are Taliban. So what I'm saying here is that majority of the Taliban they are Pashtun people. They are not educated. They do not know the Quran. Majority of them do not know the meaning of the Quran. Majority of them have no education. What happened to them was they were abandoned from their houses by their family, and then the Pakistan CIA, the Pakistan ISI supported them. The Pakistan said that we will give you the weapons, we will give you AK-47s, and we will support you. Why Pakistan did this was because Pakistan is in a huge threat of a prosperous Afghanistan. Pakistan sees that if Afghanistan become prosperous, Afghanistan is going to have taxes on my stuff that's going into this nation. If you look at Pakistan industry in that time, when Afghanistan had no economy, nothing, the Pakistan economy was booming. Take, for example, the Pervez Musharraf's government. The GDP of the Pakistan went 5% higher in each single aspect, which was going even on the higher rate, like in a small nation, if you compare it to India, it was going higher than India. India is a democratic nation. So what went wrong was that your nation became blindfolded in this threat that Al-Qaeda is after us, the Taliban are after us. They're going to come here, blow us all, But we didn't see that. No bombs were blowing in the Walmarts. No bombs were blowing in your houses. Nothing happened to this nation. But this nation got in here is the government, we're gonna make the government. Rabbani was supported, he was made leader in Pakistan, in Peshawar. He was brought back to bring in the peace. I don't want that leader in my nation. His hands are full with the blood of Afghan people, you know? And then you brought all the other warlords. Half of the Kabul has been bought by the warlords. You know, people in the rural area, we won't hate the United States. It's not that we dislike the United States. The fact is that the United States don't have these policies that it is always patriotic and has made wrong decisions. And how it made wrong decision was that when it came to the Hamid Karzai's government, as Mr. Hoh said, Hamid Karzai's government became so powerful with the U.S. money that the local leaders couldn't do anything. You know, the Jirga is the thing that brings our nations together, that brings the local people together. The people in the Jirga system can't say anything to Hamid Karzai because Hamid Karzai is in first place Pashtun, but in second place he doesn't have the support of the Pashtun area. In third place he's been gathered by all the northern allies, all the warriors that the Pashtun people is never going to trust, never going to believe in. You know, they're just not going to buy what those people are saying. And then on the other hand, the United States made our constitution in this nation. People were brought from California. There's about 40,000 Afghan families. People were brought from Washington, D.C., and they made the Constitution here. I was supposed an Afghan civilian to believe in the Constitution that you made for me in this nation. I agree with you. Your people died in this war. Your money is going into this war. But think of us as human beings. You know, think of us as at least human beings as well. You know, we're human beings also. You know, if you pull your own meat, it hurts. If you pull our meat, it hurts the same way. You know, you can't just always think of your own benefit and say we are against after the wrong, we're going to kill the wrong guy. In this war, so many innocent Afghan civilians have given their lives and things like that. And then the Hamid Karzai government sent walis to each area, the 34 provinces. And then what's happening with these walis is that the local leaders, the Maliks don't agree with, the Maliks are the people that in Afghanistan people live like 100 houses lives in a place. Say 50 people lives in a place. And they usually choose the person who is more wealthy in the area, and they call it Malik. And he's the leader. But the Malik doesn't agree with what the person that the Hamid Karzai has sent us. So this kind of system will I don't think so it will work. It is working and it will work in Afghanistan. And I believe that the United States should not pressure Pakistan as well. Because you have to think, you got rid of their best leader. Best leader was taking care of India for them. You know, you got rid of Pervez Musharraf. Pervez Musharraf is a smart guy. You know, he was eye to eye with India. He was doing stuff for Pakistan.
Let's leave it at Pakistan for a minute, but there's a lot there, so I just want to see if we can stop there on any particular points you want to come back to or comment on.
No, I would say, you know, the issues our policy had in Afghanistan in terms of excluding people, in terms of marginalizing, disenfranchising, pushing people to support the insurgency, pushing people to support Taliban, particularly, you know, Pashtuns. Same thing that occurred in Iraq. I mean, it's the same thing I saw in the Sunni areas in Iraq when I was there twice, was our policies pushed the Sunnis to support the insurgency. We basically gave them two choices. You can support the Sunni insurgency, at that time dominated by al-Qaeda in Iraq, or you can support this government in Baghdad that has basically usurped you, is composed of Shia, and is run by the Americans. I mean, both are bad choices. And so the same things I saw occur in Iraq in the sense of why people were pushed to support the insurgency, because they weren't given really any other choices. There was really no other room for them to go anywhere, were very similar to what occurred in Afghanistan with the support you've seen for the insurgency, for the Taliban over the last several years. Many people feel that they have no other choice, or the choice they do have is the lesser of two evils. So,
And I just would thank you for reminding us that the casualties are also being felt in Afghanistan. You know, I try to remind people all the time that mothers and fathers are similar all over the world. They all love their children, and you know, and there are a lot of innocent people being caught in the crossfire. There are lots of innocent people being killed, you know, and as that adds up, you know, again, I think resentment adds up too. You know, and the casualties suffered by the Afghan people have been enormous, and not just during this recent war, but if I go back to when the Soviets tried to invade Afghanistan. And by the way, I think there's an argument, I don't know how many Soviet historians are here, but I mean, you could probably make the argument that the fall of the Soviet Union could be directed to the fact they spent their resources in this failed war in Afghanistan. So, but there are the casualties. I mean, the men and the women and the children who are dying because of this war every day is just enormous, and it really is something that should give us all pause.
Question over here before, was someone? Someone had a hand up over there around the corner. Can you stand up or come behind? Okay, come on.
Yes, sir. I had a question about the, you mentioned a statistic about the disapproval rate of the war, but then you went on to mention that there was no active protesting the war or calling of the congressman or other political figures. I was wondering why there was this absence of drive to end the war from the population of the United States people, but there's this large disapproval rate.
Yeah. You know, I asked, I had this explained to me by, I'm nonpartisan in my work, so I actually got this answer from Grover Norquist. So I bounce back and forth on both sides here. It's a difference between what's a want, you know, what's a nice to have, and what's a priority. So if you ask people, how do you feel about the Afghan war, they're going to give you an answer. But if it's not affecting their lives, they're not going to do anything about it. So if you look at the numbers from 2006, during the 2006 midterm elections, the war in Iraq, you know, the numbers vary depending on the poll, the way the question was asked, but, you know, between 35 to 45% of the people voted in 2006 with Iraq being their primary concern. Well, why was that? Well, or how come they didn't vote on something else? Well, the economy was doing very well then. Everybody's house was worth twice what they had paid for it. I mean, so I think they had bandwidth or space to care about issues that were not directly affecting them. I think with Afghanistan, the economy is certainly not where it was in 2006. You know, the housing market. I mean, everybody now has not just one home on their block in foreclosure, but 2 or 3. Everybody knows. I mean, so it's those kinds of things in the sense of that people weren't directly affected by it, and they had other things that were directly affecting. So I think people only have so much, you know, bandwidth to do so much. And I think that's the explanation, because it's true. You looked in 2010, it came out between only 4 to 6% or so, between 4 and 6% of the people voted with the war as their prime issue. You know,
I'd say two other things. There's no draft. I'm not advocating for a draft, but there's no draft. If there was, I think there'd be more protest. 2, you're not paying for it. So if you were assessed the tax to pay for it, you might think, do I want to pay for this? And so, I mean, this is what this is a war that's going on with not a lot of attention from the media, no draft, no tax. So yeah, you may be against it, but it's like, as Matt said, it's really not affecting you. So it doesn't compel you to go out on the streets and protest.
And the other issue too is how much of the anti-Iraq protest was actually anti-Bush. How much of that was just anger at President Bush? I'm very frustrated with many of the groups that organized opposition to the Iraq war who failed to do so with the Afghan war. I see it when I work with the different peace groups, peace action or whatever. They have problems raising money because their core supporters are Obama supporters. And so they are reluctant to give money against the president. Meanwhile, in 2006, 2007, I met Tom Matzey, who ran the anti-Iraq campaign for MoveOn.org, and he said every time I went someplace, someone was giving him $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, with basically the pretext of like, screw Bush, I hate that guy. So how much of, and I think there's some research being done on that, but I think a lot of it was just the politics of it.
I have really yet to see a good way to do it. You say, pull all the troops out, the government's going to implode. Leave 30,000 troops there. That's still 30,000 troops away from their families. You know, you kind of trickle them out, then we have 10,000 troops that are left unsupported when they're still insurgents, kind of still upset that we have people there. Studying military sciences, Army ROTC today, we spend so much time doing operations orders with how we're going to do this step by step, very meticulously. But yet there is yet to be a meticulous plan and the right way to pull out. You know, because I'm all about bringing the troops home. I mean, by all means, my first, I don't want to be deployed to Iraq. I don't want to be a platoon leader of a platoon where 4 of my men get blown up. I don't want to be there. But I also don't want to pull out all the troops and leave all of Iraqi civilians, who are humans too, alone to self-implode and have another Rwanda situation.
Yep.
So do you guys have any suggestions of a right way to pull out without leaving anyone behind?
You know, it's difficult because 2 years ago, you're in this position where you're advocating, do not escalate this war. And then we escalate the war, and now we're in this position. I had very clear ideas 2 years ago. My ideas they're relatively the same. You want to, those areas that we have put troops in over the last several years, just pull them out. Get them out of those areas and move them to areas in the northwest or urban parts of the country where we have real support from the Afghan population. I mean, if you look at Afghan public opinion numbers, you'll see there's like a 60-40 split. But 60% of the country is in favor of a foreign presence. Unfortunately, 40% of the country is violently opposed. So you want to get troops out of those areas. But you're right, you can't just have them disappear because then a vacuum occurs. So the idea is that you bring in peacekeepers. Most likely it'd be a majority Muslim force. Doesn't necessarily have to be, but that's ideas that have been brought about. Interestingly, the Taliban raises, Mullah Omar raised this issue in 2009, I believe, the idea of international peacekeepers to replace the ISAF presence. So you're right, because you can't just disappear them, but you also have the very real, it's very real that their presence is fueling the insurgency. So idea, get them out of those areas, get them out of those places where they're only, causing to be, their only purpose is to be shot at every day and replace them with international peacekeepers. But all this has to be done in a framework of political negotiations. I mean, and that's what I think, if you could take one thing away, is that we've not done that. We have not legitimately been engaged in political efforts in that country. We all say that it's a political solution to the country or to the country's problems, but we've not honestly done that. And until we do that, nothing will work. But it has to be, anything you do with troops has to have that parallel political process next to it.
I'm going to tell you something that's going to shock you. Intelligence is not necessarily a prerequisite for serving in the United States Congress. This discussion that we're having here right now, this question, this is the stuff we should be debating and talking about in a serious way in the halls of Congress. How to get our troops home in a safe and orderly way, how to encourage a legitimate peace negotiation, a political settlement that will probably involve some countries in the region that we don't like very much. And when I was in Afghanistan in June, I couldn't get anybody to talk to me about what Matt just talked about, the plan to bring our troops home, or what's going on with the peace process. And I'll just say one final thing. We have a lot of problems around the world. The answer to every problem, is not an American military solution. I mean, it isn't. And there are some things that we can't solve. I mean, I co-chair the Human Rights Commission. I mean, I just did a human rights hearing on, the human rights abuses in Tibet. I wish I could have a way to get China to free Tibet and let people practice whatever religion they want to. I don't know how we do that. The situation in Darfur was a genocide going on. I mean, I argued at the time that we should have an international no-fly zone, so that Bashir couldn't, send his troops to kill people. We didn't do it, people were wiped out. I was arrested twice, protesting that genocide in front of the Sudanese embassy. I'm glad my parole officer let me be with you tonight. But the fact of the matter is, I think we have to understand we can't fix every problem. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to fix things that we can fix or try to influence it. But this kind of, even in Libya, we're all cheering the fact that Gaddafi has been eliminated. But now what? I mean, what do we just do? And what does all this mean? And I worry that sometimes we think that there are quick fix solutions to things, and that maybe if we just send in the troops or do this, the men. I would say this: the men and women who are serving in Afghanistan and who have served in Iraq, who I've met with. I mean, I'm in awe of their service. These are incredible men and women. I mean, really, it sounds like I'm a, commercial for, the U.S. Armed Forces or whatever. But the commitment and the dedication and the courage of these people are unbelievable, and that's what makes me all the more angry that we are putting these great men and women in this situation. They did not create this situation. These decisions are being made by policymakers in Washington. And I think as I look at what's happened in Afghanistan, we owed our troops a hell of a lot better than we gave them. I mean, it is shocking. And I think, as I said before, Matt deserves a lot of credit for the guts he had to publicly resign the way he did. But, I mean, sometimes it's like you had to apply the shock treatment to get people to pay attention. When he resigned, lots of papers covered this story on the front page, and there was a discussion. And then, like everything else, we have an attention span of about 48 hours, and then we move on to something else. But these things need to be talked about.
I have a question over here. Last one.
Jim, thanks for your service. Also, Matt and Joe, congratulations, Matt. My question is, just a statement. There's not a whole lot of activity going on in Washington. And as a taxpayer and as a voter, I'm kind of appalled at what's going on in Congress. It's gridlock. So to come here and I guess you're reaching out because you're frustrated because nothing's happening. You said we can call our congressmen and email, but this is a very small, very homogeneous section of the country. I mean, we got the blue states, we got the red states, we got the purple states. So.
But the students here are from multiple states.
Sure.
Yeah. So.
I get it, but again, very homogeneous all across. So, my point is, yeah, people are here, but most people, the average American is not real well informed about stuff. And Matt, kudos for quoting Maslow with your hammer thing. Anytime a Marine can quote Maslow, I think that's a good thing. So, I guess my
Thank you for telling me who it was from.
How do we change how do we change things here to get Congress moving? And really it's about, and it's an election year for the president. I don't think he's going to be wanting to make a lot of waves. I mean, he sort of wants to not be one and done, as a lot of the guys would like to have it said. And we were in this place in '84. I was in the military in '84 when we were fighting the Russians there. And we had guys in Afghanistan at that time, not a whole lot, but we were teaching these guys how to use Stinger missiles from horseback and stuff. And then we just left the place. We just left it. And, there's a great movie, Charlie Wilson's War, based on a true story. And we just left a big void there, whatever. There was no interest generated. So I guess I'm a little frustrated with the government. I've been around the world. I've seen a lot of people on the ground, military, State Department people, know the lay of the land, very, very wise about what's going on. But there's a disconnect between the information that gets sent from the countries to the government. And it's like who's ever in power, the whims and caprices, and who wants popular opinion. So I feel like we're bucking a system here that's well entrenched, and it's hard to get any sort of movement. And what do we need to do? I mean, do we need to take our clothes off like Scott Brown? And you know what? I don't fault the guy. He gets school.
All right, well, we'll leave it at that. What do we got?
No, okay, yeah, no, I remind people all the time that the government we have is who the people here elected, whether you like it or not, you know? If 20% of the people show up to vote in an election, then the government you have is who 20% of the people voted for. If 80% show up, then the government you have is who 80% voted for. People need to take their citizenship responsibility seriously. People need to understand that they have power, that they have a voice, and it is difficult, I know, with all that's going on, with the disconnect that's going on in Washington. But I will tell you now that part of the problem in Washington is that the people who have money and the corporate interests that have money, you know, they continue to push and push and push, and regular people are either giving up or walking away or don't feel that they can make a difference. And I'm here to tell you that I think people can make a difference. If 25 people stand in front of my office and protest, it doesn't have to be 2,500. If 25 people are in my office, I will take notice. You know, I guarantee you, if 25 people are in front of John Kerry's office or Scott Brown's office, they will take notice. You know, but we have become accustomed to kind of forfeiting our rights, and that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem in terms of information, and one of the reasons why, you know, I wanted Matt to come here, I think it's important. The way you get informed is you come to things like this. You know, I turned on the Today Show today, and Matt Lauer was in some far-off country. You know, where was Matt Lauer was the whole thing. While, you know, while we're in the worst economic crisis of the Great Depression, you know, we need to demand more, you know, in terms of information. But I'll tell you, I think, you know, newspapers and magazines and TV shows give you what they think you want. And the more entertainment, the better the ratings. You know, the more serious, the less the ratings. We need to start demanding, you know, supporting more serious, you know, forms of news. I mean, I do, when people find out the facts and people realize what's going on and they get in discussion, I think people feel more compelled to take action. But people have power, they really do. And they have to, you know, organize, you know, and they have to push back. And if you don't, then this continues, you know, and, you know, I'm appalled, you know, at the money in elections. You know, you want to run for Congress, is a couple $1 million. That's a lot of money to raise every 2 years, you know, and so all the people with money, you know, they seem to be kind of controlling the debate and what we're talking about, and that's why the super committee seems like such a disconnect for what real people think. But I'm going to tell you, the more people start to protest this Occupy movement, whatever you think about it, it's caught people's attention. What's going on here? Why, you know, why are all these people out there? Some people may think it's, you know, refreshing. Some people may think it's not so refreshing. But clearly, it's causing a little bit of discussion. Whether it's sustainable or not, I don't know. But people need to take a stand. I mean, if they don't, then this is what you get.
I don't know how you do it, but I think we need a draft or some form of national service in this country. And I mean, I know politically that'd be near impossible. And then the actual mechanics of it, you know, as a former Marine, the merits of the all-volunteer force I completely agree with, but there's such a disconnect between what's occurring and what people care about. And I think the only way you change that is to force people to care. You know, but that's what comes to my mind. I always think about being in a bar in like February of 2003, and there are these guys standing over here, and they're arguing about Iraq, whether we should invade or not. And one guy said, yeah, you know, we need to. The other guy said, no, we don't need to. And the third guy said, you know what the thing I know? I know I'm not going. And I thought that was the truest thing I ever heard about the war in Iraq, was that guy knew he was not going to war. It didn't matter. I mean, so how do we bring people in the conversation? You know, and again, I do think the idea of a draft or some form of national service, how you put that together, how you actually get it passed in Congress, I mean, like, very difficult. But I think that's forcing people to care maybe one way about it. But yeah.
Well, thank you both for an insightful conversation. Thank you all for coming tonight.